I'm Tommy DeFrance, the Chair of African and African American Studies here at Duke, and it's my great happy task and pleasure to welcome you to our 2017 conference, Global Blackness, a Multidisciplinary Exploration. This symposium has at least two purposes: to explore the concept of global blackness as a worthy intellectual object or attractive device that might open out unexpected modes of analysis and theorization relating to capital, consent, and citizenship, at least. What can global blackness do as a gathering notion that allows a capacious consideration of black thought as resistant act or willful transgression? How can global blackness help us retrim our sails toward the waters of black liberation from race? The conference also allows those of us working here at Duke in AAAS, African American Studies, a welcome and almost unprecedented gathering moment among each other to share points of view. We operate here in AAAS as an interdiscipline, drawing resource from our varied perspectives and disciplinary grounds, varied ambitions, and highly differentiated experiences as faculty and people. In this event, we gather to answer a call from global blackness as a potentially grounding concept to our shared labor. We hope that listening to each other think through urgent research questions that occupy us as they might relate to our theme will help us recognize each other more carefully. So we begin with thanks. We thank our support staff, especially our administrator, Stacey Nicole Robinson, who does the work of half dozen people, and you've all met Stacey Nicole at some point. If global blackness is inevitably about being overtasked, Stacey Nicole should offer her comments at this event. She and Kenya Harris and the Friedel Building staff allow us to work with our ideas and our students at Duke, and we thank them heartily for their unmitigated achievement. Also thanks here to the Franklin Humanities Institute, Deborah Jensen's its director, and the Humanities Future Funding that sponsors this event. We also, and most importantly, thank our guest speakers who've come from diverse parts of the world and bring divergent approaches to bear on the fact of blackness and the implications of global blackness as an analytic lens. Your work has encouraged us already, and we've asked you to join us and share your ideas so that we might grow from your perspectives. Last year's AAAS conference was titled Global Slavery's Impossible Freedoms, and it brought together 15 outstanding researchers to consider the intellectual legacies of John Hope Franklin. The event was keynoted by four well-established researchers: artist Lorna Simpson, cultural theorist Saidiya Hartman, activist icon Angela Davis, and Harvard President Drew Faust. I was fortunate to share that conference committee alongside our colleague Tavolia Glemth, and Tavolia celebrates a milestone as she has recently been promoted to full professor in history and African American studies. And I think we can give her a hand clap even though she's not here with us right now. This year, the prompt for our gathering is offered by our colleague Michaeline Critchlow, and we thank Michaeline for her fine work in galvanizing our thinking. The conference is organized as a series of short presentations, roundtables, and keynote speakers. On the panel, speakers will offer short presentations, followed by conversation around shared arisings or differences of approach. We hope for the event to feel like an intellectual provocation toward the recognition of a communal possibility. To set us off tonight, before our first keynote, I want to quote from the intellectual prompt that Critchlow provided to us. This symposium intends to inaugurate an appeal for a mode of analysis that at once recognizes the pervasiveness of race as construct and assemblage that structures dominance and manages, orders, and delimits rights of belonging through a focus on bodies, spaces, practices, and identities conjured through blackness. An approach addressing global blackness deals less with affinities of identity. Rather, it announces an optic that is attuned to a politics of the non-relational, produced within the topologies of hegemonic narratives that constitutes man's beings in the world. We wonder if attention to the notion of a global blackness will prompt a deeper comparative study of how others incorporated into the relational histories of freedom and global racial politics counteract the twin force of going global and disavowing place by invoking other kinds of politics, perhaps nationalist or religious identities, to establish and secure their places in the world. Critchlow and her writing partner, Patricia Northover, who will be our first keynote tonight, remind us that this process would at the very least require engaging a broader critical literature in order to pursue a closer examination of the political technologies, governmental and developmental strategies for reproducing universal space and Black time in the dynamic impulse and changing context of becoming global. To think, global actually in this case. To think structural inequalities, we would have to purposefully think beyond the geographies of the Atlantic and beyond Americocentric notions of lived Blackness by which too many scholars measure the sensorial texture of Black worlds. As we struggle to imagine beyond the American-centric entanglements of Black life, we imagine broadly beyond our own Black bodies here in Durham, North Carolina, toward other places and other circumstances similarly and differently subscribed and circumscribed by disavowal, abjection, and material lack. I might hope that global Blackness does not predict global despair. Repeatedly, I despair around the conditions of my own Blackness, even as I struggle towards something like joy. Struggling towards might be a mode of critical engagement that gives us purpose here, struggling to communicate across our varied points of entry to a conversation and toward action that might enhance Black life in its unrelenting variety. This is the shared mission of AAAS at Duke, developing and circulating strategies for engaging with and understanding the experiences of Black people globally. So let's begin our work here with a multidisciplinary exploration of contours of global Blackness. Thank you and welcome.
Hello. Patricia Northover is a dear friend and muse, interlocutor, collaborator, whom I've known for a long time. Our first joint venture was a paper called Power and Its Subjects, Development Dilemmas, Post-Colonial Restructuring of Rural Space, Place Identities, and State Reconfigurations in Contemporary Globalization Processes. It was a typical Patricia Northover title. Nothing less than a paragraph would do. I was presenting this paper in a plenary at the International Rural Sociological Association in Trondheim, in Norway, with some really famous scholars. I needed to impress. I arrived in Trondheim slightly upset because I had been pulled aside at the gate by a US immigration officer who looked me up and down and asked me where I was headed, why, and what else was I carrying with me. To which I answered, a 55-page paper. I think it was maybe my Mephisto sandals that made him suspicious, but I was quickly shooed along and boarded without further ado. It was the summer of 2004, and I was carrying a 55-page co-authored paper to be delivered in 25 minutes, making my first trip to Norway, the land of sustainable agriculture. I remember suddenly feeling panicked the day before because I could not reduce the paper enough. So what did I do? I called Pat and we went through the paper section by section, or was it line by line? I'm not sure. But when I checked out of the hotel, I was presented with an invoice of no mistake. It was my most expensive call ever. But it marked the start of a collaborative venture. Patricia Northover specializes in economic philosophy and critical development studies. She's a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies at Mona in Jamaica, and chair of the Sustainable Rural and Agricultural Development Research Cluster at SALISIS. Patricia completed her MPhil and doctoral degrees in economics at the University of Cambridge and has been a fellow at Girton College, University of Cambridge, and a visiting Mellon Fellow Professor at Duke quite recently. She's the co-editor of the journal Cultural Dynamics and the author and co-author of many articles, books, chapters, and edited volumes on the philosophy of economics, cultural dynamics, economic growth, climate change, and Caribbean development, as well as on the negritude movement and the racial philosophy of place. Her influential work has been published in the South Atlantic Quarterly, Cambridge Journal of Economics, Cultural Dynamics, Global South, Caribbean Dialogue, Small State Digest, and others. She is currently completing the production of a 2-film series on the history of the sugar industry of Jamaica, the first of a 4-part adult documentary entitled Sugar Cane, or Raising Cane, really? Is it? You changed it? Sugar cane. Oh, copyright issues. I'm co-producer on this as well. Recycling Sweetness and Power in Modern Jamaica. And the second, a whimsical children's animation series called Miss Sugar. Patricia Northover also collaborates with me on the Race-Based Place project launched in 2008, which seeks to offer critical multidisciplinary dialogue on the intersection of these forces and hosts academic dialogue as well as other forms of reflection on the making and unmaking of freedoms in the Atlantic and beyond. She has also been my collaborator on the book Globalization and Post-Creole Imagination, Notes on Fleeing the Plantation. Her most recent forthcoming publications include Race and Rurality in the Global Economy, co-edited with myself and Juan Justi Cordero from the University of Puerto Rico, and her monograph, Modern Growth Theory, A Critical Philosophical Perspective. I know of no other person who's an economic philosopher. I know of no other Black woman who's an economic philosopher. This evening, she will share some thoughts on thinking global Blackness through the frame of Angelus Novus, an exploration of racial aporias, primitive accumulation, and the invidious chronopolitics of progress. Thank you. And please welcome Patricia Northover.
Very deeply blessed to be here today. Had a number of challenges trying to get to Duke. My daughter is actually recovering from a very, very bad flu, and she insisted that I not come to this conference and stay home and take care of her. And I somehow manipulated the situation, and she allowed me to come. So there's a price to be paid for being a single mom. But I wanted to express my deep gratitude and appreciation to, of course, Tommy for inviting me here to this conference on global blackness, and Deborah Jensen, chair of the Humanities Futures Group, and of course, Michaeline Critchlow, a longtime friend and a collaborator, and the godparent of my daughter, whom we have worked on, as she has indicated, on numerous publications. And I do have a tendency towards denseness, which Michaeline likes to say, Pat, please stop. So I hope you don't feel this way when I'm talking. Pat, please stop. But if you do, I'll try and recognize it in your faces and quickly rush to a conclusion. Today's presentation is a bit of an exploratory project, and I must admit that it's still an incomplete paper. And while I have a number of sections that I would have wanted to elaborate today, I won't be able to do so. But I will elaborate on the sections that I think within the time period that I'm allowed, we'll be able to engage. So this has been a larger, wider project, which is linked to my, as Michaeline mentioned, my forthcoming book project. And I'm trying to work through, as an economist, I was trained as an economist, yes. I have a first degree in economics and management, a second degree in social sciences, a third degree in MPhil in economics, and a fourth degree in economics. So I've been in the mill, and I was hired as an economist. But my thinking and my direction has been a little bit wider than the lenses that I was trained in as an economist. Unfortunately, I had a philosopher and economist as my supervisor, someone called Tony Lawson, who has been at the forefront of something that I'm not sure if you're aware of, critical realism. So that is where my philosophical bent actually started. But I'm hoping that given the dire state of economics, this kind of underlaboring, as we like to call it in the critical realist project, will be useful. I think I've gone beyond critical realism, and I've been deeply engaging with some of the leading critical philosophical thinkers like Amartya Sen on his work. But I'm hoping that this will bear good fruit in terms of development practice, because that's ultimately what my profession is, to look at human beings, their context, their livelihoods, and to try and make a difference. So even though I may get a little bit lost in my philosophy, the reason that I put so much energy into it is because I think, sorry, is because I think that it makes a profound difference to our present and our potential futures. So that's my context. I'd like now to make my presentation to you. In this exploratory essay, I would like to offer a way, my voice is breaking. I hope I'm not getting the flu my daughter gave me. Okay, let's try again. In this exploratory essay, I would like to offer a way of thinking about the generative processes that bring about and sustain a specific form of globalizing blackness, namely an abject or spectral blackness. These generative processes, I argue, to be inherent in modern power modalities, but complexly folded by time. As such, I suggest that we begin our meditations on the idea of global blackness with a modern pictorial frame, that of Paul Klee's 1920 painting of Angelus Novus, an oil transfer drawing with watercolor that seems to capture the spirit of our modern age of being betwixt and between global warfare and terror. This is a painting that deeply inspired the German Jewish philosopher, cultural and literal critic, Walter Benjamin, who at one point dallied with and influenced the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, yet was unable to really belong to its frames. Indeed, Benjamin, a fragile and tragic figure caught up within European-centered geopolitical instabilities, lived in the conjuncture of a certain unbelonging. Indeed, in particular, he lived a specific experience of displacement and being a problem as a Jew stitched within the frames of modern history. Furthermore, he lived this conjuncture particularly deeply, largely because he was a contingent bearer of a particular yet impossible identity, that of a German Jew. His positioning within the incoherences of specific spatiotemporal frames, I conjecture, underlines his fascination with Klee's painting and provides him with inspiration for philosophy of history that calls upon what he referred to as a weak messianic power. Benjamin's philosophy brings a certain view of history into light that disrupts the chronotime of linear history, which he termed homogeneous empty time, in order to see time's flow more in line with Bergson's theory of duration. Here, time, while being practically indexed by past, present, and future, nonetheless overlaps and incites temporal pulses of rhythmic and arrhythmic moments, movements, as well as disjointed flows. Bergson's concept of duration places particular emphasis on, however, the idea of time as a process in which the lived durée of the past folds unpredictably in our grasping of the present, and, as William Connolly emphasizes in his text on pluralism, Bergson's durational time impresses itself without determination into our agential powers and politics of becoming. The time of duration for Benjamin would also entail that a weak messianic power is seeded in the process of lived time. This weak messianic power suggests a situation in which the present and its generation acts as a limen for the hopes of the past for the redemption in the future. Or, as Benjamin states in Illuminations, in Illuminations, a 1968 text which gathers a collection of his works that is edited by, with an introduction offered from a kindred spirit, Hannah Arendt, Jewish political philosopher. And here I quote him: "The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. Accordingly, as Andrew Robinson suggests in a fairly recent online article on Messianism and Revolution, examining Benjamin's thesis on history, in this quote, his second of 18 in the philosophy of history, Benjamin implies that present revolutions redeem or continue past revolutions. Perhaps then, in a similar vein to Marx's own thesis, that the history of class struggle expresses a dialectical tendency for revolutionary reconstitutions of society at large. We hope. Or collective ruin if that fails. It is important to note here, though, that while Benjamin gives voice to the dead in the revolution, Marx insists in his 18th Brumaire that the poetry of the revolution cannot come from the past. In fact, he stated, "The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future." In beginning this reflection then on global blackness, through the frames of the painting Angelus Novus, Walter Benjamin's own peculiar time-space of unbelonging and impossibility, I wish to directly position a thinking of global blackness then in the complexly folded chronopolitics of our modern histories, or as Patricia Northover expressed it, human identity stories. In particular, I wish to address the character of its time spaces and its repressed but ever-present relation with ghosts. Ghosts that haunt the present, but also give weight to at least a weak messianic power to those ineluctably engaged in the politics of redemption. First then, is it possible for us to dwell with global blackness, not so much as a claim to a certain kind of spatialized being, that is, as an identity perforce performed under the weight of the body? Although blackness is of course unimaginable without such ostensive claims about a certain contextualized way of living and encountering being in the world, so the first claim I'm making is whether or not we can think beyond that particular way of reading global blackness. So, rather, could we see more as a basis for a particular claim of untimely becoming? An untimeliness indicative of, as Wilder notes, a being out of sync with the corresponding historical period. This latter sense proposed here projects other claims into the world, claims bearing a weak messianic power for redemption, claims that, as Benjamin stated, cannot be taken lightly. Indeed, I would wish to add here that such claims are perhaps also very much attuned to a politics of resurrection, and in this case, a messianic temporality, Benjamin's monad, addressing the time to come, or as Benjamin describes it, a specific life out of the era, or a specific work out of the life work, a life work that is preserved in this work and at the same time cancelled. This view is relevant if we immediately recognize in the political temporalities of global blackness and redemption the very active presence, rather than passive and easily manipulated interests, of those ghosts haunting the internal relation of modernity and coloniality, to which we owe Walter Mignolo a great thanks in popularizing that relationship. This problem of haunting is creatively reflected in Toni Morrison's Beloved, and insightfully explored by Avery Gordon in her seminal 1997 text on Ghostly Matters. In this regard, I believe that in following this track, we would also benefit from thinking global blackness along the very nuanced lines of a Caesarean negritude and its politics of dépassement, which he put forward in his 1987 Miami speech as a reactivation of the past with a view to its own surpassing, or a way of living a history within history. This line of thinking is one that I cannot elaborate here, but one which Mike Linkritchley and I have begun to explore elsewhere in an article published last year in the South Atlantic Quarterly on Aimé Césaire. The second way I would like us to think of global blackness is to perceive of it as a type of force implicated in the rising debris of ruination that is being impelled by the violent storm of progress, and to which our backs have been turned, as Benjamin's interpretation of the Cleese Angelus Novus suggests. If we follow Benjamin here, Cleese Angelus Novus is an angel of history, looking with eyes staring, mouth open, and wings spread, and I quote, as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. And as Benjamin further suggests, the angel, that is, his face, is turned to the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees a single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly impels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. Overall, then, in introducing thinking about global blackness with Walter Benjamin's reflections on the Cleese painting as a guide, I consider our task here as a studious consideration of how global blackness operates, and, to use Benjamin's words, a constellation within which our own era has formed with a definite earlier one. Yet, a constellation that is, as Benjamin avers, and I quote, is shot through with chips of messianic time. For the remainder of this presentation, I will try first to unpack a bit of this constellation of Global Blackness via a critical reading of Michelle Wright's 2015 text, The Physics of Blackness, then I wish to locate the time-space or chronotype of global blackness through the presence of racial aporias. In the third section, I wish to link such aporias to the articulation of race as a relation of forces via the sovereign imaginary. My final section, which cannot be presented here, given the time constraints, would look at the processes of racial formation, the interlocking of processes of racial formation with the processes of sovereign imaginaries and that of primitive accumulation. I would then conclude with a brief review of my main points. So that was the broad hope of this paper, and we'll see how far we got. So part 2, unpacking a constellation. Recently, Michelle Wright, in her text, Physics of Blackness, has suggested that we need to investigate the phenomenon of blackness not in relation to a what, but in relationship to a stitching together of a certain time space, a where and a when. Wright's objective is to move away from a certain objectification of blackness on the body, and also away from a fundamentalist initialization of blackness via middle passage journeys, as she states it. These are historical spaces that have been deployed as a legitimizing canon for discourses on diasporic or global blackness. In contrast, she wishes to pay attention to, and I quote, a phenomenology of blackness. That is, to a when and where it is being imagined, defined, performed, and in what locations, both figurative and literal. That's on page 3. In her argument, blackness is irreducibly performative. As she states, and I quote, blackness then is largely a matter of perception, or, as performance studies theorist E. Patrick Johnson observes, made up of moments of performance in which performers understand their bodies as black. She adds controversially that, and I quote, because it is not necessary for the audience to understand such performances as black, except, in brackets, in the matter of ticket sales and perhaps favorable reviews, close brackets, this further suggests that blackness is in the mind of the performer. She summarizes her thesis as follows. The physics of blackness, beyond the middle passage epistemology, argues that blackness operates as a construct, implicitly or explicitly defined as a shared set of physical and behavioral characteristics, and as a phenomenological, imagined through individual perceptions in various ways depending on the context. As such, we can best locate and define blackness across the African diaspora by incorporating both of these aspects into our analysis within and without the academy. In all this, I suggest that Wright is reaching towards a methodology that she believes will allow her for a more inclusive assemblage of experiences as black. Hence, her emphasis lies less in discounting of what she refers to as the linear progress narratives, in which she argues middle passage epistemologies and constructs of blackness are lodged, than in supplementing this with another register marking blackness, this being what she refers to as epiphenomenal time, or, and I quote, the now, through which the past, present, and future are always interpreted. So blackness through epiphenomenal time. In her creative engagement for a more inclusionary politics to produce a new global blackness as such, Wright seems, however, to elide the registers of modern power in reducing one's understanding of blackness to either linear progress narratives or epiphenomenal time. What is worst, I believe, is that her well-intentioned efforts to overcome or escape the divisive dichotomous readings of blackness, especially in the United States, leads her to promote a sort of methodological individualism for enabling a scene of blackness to emerge with epiphenomenal time. This cutting of a figure of blackness problematically also cuts out the inherently relational suturing of human experiences and its complex modes of producing the time spaces through which differential agential desires or senses of selves or identity get played out. And while she endorses leaving race behind as something not real, given the numerous epistemological problems of distinguishing amongst humans based on biological natures, in order to account for blackness in diverse processes of construction and their dynamic flexibility, it seems unlikely that this effort will succeed. In other words, I'm saying that I'm not sure that this methodology would allow her to leave race behind. Thus, as John Jackson exclaims in his 2005 introductory essay on racial Americana, published in the South Atlantic Quarterly, the title of that essay being A Little Black Magic, he states, "No, race is not alive, not anymore. We've killed it, deconstructed it to death, social constructed it, I'm not sure if I can pronounce that, socially constructionized it out of fully animate existence. But it is hardly that easy. Instead, our beast has risen from the dead and haunts our every waking hour. It is the bogeyman in our collective social closet. Make-believe, but all the more frightening for its irreality, its ghostly intangibility." Thus, as John Jackson has suggested in his introduction to that special journal issue, despite attempts to shift the discourse, and it has indeed been shifted, as seen, for example, in Speaking to Racism Without Race, as Eduardo Bonilla puts forward, or in the controversial move to announce a post-racial world in the United States, specifically, or with Wright's Physics of Blackness and her promotion of a shifting utility of signifying practices for broadening the spectrum of blackness, one still remains entangled by the questions raised by the dead hand of race on the present. So, despite not being able to say what race is exactly, which Fanon in his explosive text, White Mask, Black Skin, already recognized, one still encounters racial power effects as expressed principally in reductive violence and visceral dehumanizing and exclusionary effects upon bodies, subjects, populations, communities, and spaces. The evidence for such racial effects is certainly palpably evident in the United States, with its racialized cohorts of incarcerated, detained, denied, terrorized, impoverished, and excluded, or generally marginalized and made to live precarious lives. But such racialized experiences extend elsewhere. For example, we can impute that lived blackness is being racialized when blackness becomes invariably associated with cultures of poverty, violence, and/or corruption. Or when spaces become mythically charged with blackness and people, places, and cultures are essentialized and frozen into ahistorical scripts predicting homogeneous tendencies for typically ethnic or black-on-black violence and conflict. Drawn on the stock of such racialized scripts, for example, Easterly and Levine in a 1997 article entitled Africa's Growth Tragedy, Policies and Ethnic Divisions, published in the prestigious Journal for Economists, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, sought to provide explanations for the region's then slow growth based on this racialized discourse. Which leads one to the question of why. Why should this be the case? Indeed, why should it be that, despite striving for so long to sing from the same hymn book of modern growth and progress, the world remains beset by terrible scenes of racial haunting and an unraveling of political settlements? Has our world system, despite its race to progress and freedom, given its declared triumph over that exceptionalized evil of Nazism, taken an untimely turn so soon? Now turn to my third section, racial aporias and the times of global blackness. Now, in order to respond to the tenacity of opaquely racialized discourses and the tenacity of racialized experiences, we need to probe more deeply into the character of what Fanon spoke to as the fact of blackness. Or, as Fred Moten suggests, in an excellent intervention on the problem of pathologizing of blackness, perhaps it is better to address the case of blackness. That is, insofar as we are dealing with something apparently to be held forever under suspicion, hovering in the zone of impossibility, constantly under interrogation, with the threat of violence continuously suspended in the air. But how does an examination of race or its ghostly matter assist us here? While multiple discourses exist on what race is or is not, how racial identities are engendered or performed, and how racial power is to be identified, the shifting terms of debate has led Anne-Laura Stoller to seek to interpret this embarrassment of riches as a reflection of changing truth regimes. At best, then, what we have, or what we seem to have, are diverse stories of what composes what Omi and Wynett, in their 1986 intervention, critically refer to as racial formations. This underlines not just the force of real historical processes of racialization, but their multiplicity and complexity, mediating, shaping, and giving concrete texture to experiences. It is not surprising, then, that several perspectives are on offer in treating with race, or getting rid of it, as Paul Gilroy has suggested. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, none of the accounts on offer see a pervasive role for race in composing the nature and dynamic of sovereignty, nor do they seem to address its mode of implication in the nature and dynamic of the capital relation sustaining modern forms of power beyond what Marx identified as the initial stage of primitive accumulation, which is marked by what was considered to be extra-economic forces, such as slavery. I wish to suggest, sorry, I wish to suggest that this arguable gap exists, first because of the weight of the Foucauldian analytics of race, operationalized within the terms of biopower and biopolitics, which focus largely upon the terms of modern rationalities of power reshaping the social spaces of Europe. A mode of analysis which required the illusion of the force of sovereignty as absolute power exercised over a social whole, and thus paid less attention to the presence of what may be called relational histories of coloniality and modernity. Second, I believe this gap exists because of the entrapment of theoretical reflections in the powerful and complexly coded binary analytics of non-whiteness and whiteness, whether expressed within the terms of a cultural sociology or via subjectivist performances within a phenomenology of experience, or as a cultural politics of hegemony and its representational strategies, including those pursued by states in legal formulations of the unstable construction of racial categories. These approaches, while offering critical insights into the diverse levers through which a discourse of race can be translated into social processes, and demonstrating the vital implication of nation-state formation in racial projects, remain limited, I believe, because they still place the greater weight of analysis on tracing a substantive ground, objective or subjective, cultural or legally composed, for possible being and becoming in the world. This, I think, is implicitly seen as necessary in order to get around the aporetic or uncertain qualities of race and racialization processes. And perhaps to a large degree, it is ineluctable to seek out these types of alternative groundings of the elusive object under study. However, I wish to put forward here that this aporia, inherent in the phenomenology of race or race effects as secreted into the world and our lived experience, is really the distinctive quality to begin with. In other words, the racial aporias encountered in life and theoretical effort, rendering certain things and experiences uncertain, undecidable, and unassimilable, really point to the general condition of uncertainty belying strong ontological claims. Derrida is keen to stress this aspect of our life experiences, introducing the concept of hauntology, which, as Jonathan Joseph points out, is not something reducible to the certainties of ontological being and non-being, presence and absence, or life and death. Hauntology is a world of spirits and specters. It is a world where, as Frederick Jameson stated, the living present is scarcely as self-sufficient as it claims to be. Now, this quality of race then, as neither object nor subject, neither concept nor essential identity, indeed, its quality of scarcely existing at all, makes it operate within this context of hauntologies. The ghostly matter of race, as Dubois suggested in his own effort to tease out the qualities of racialized life, needs to address then race not as a concept as such, but rather, as he states, and I quote, "a complex of forces, facts, and tendencies. Race as a spectral phenomena interpolates being and marks it without being necessary or essential to that being. Racialized relations thus possess an ontological status rather than an ontological one. Or, as Holt remarked, Fanon's and Dubois' discovery of their racial selves is indeed important. It is important that theirs is in fact a discovery, for their race inheres neither in biology nor in culture, but must be summoned to consciousness by their encounters in social space and historical time. This nature of the social space and historical time, I believe, is best examined through Bakhtin's concept of chronotope, introduced in his 1981 text, The Dialogic Imagination, to address the nature of the assimilation of real historical time and space in literature, and showing the importance of this for the production of literary genres. In addressing the effort of pressing the fiction, race, into reality, I believe that this concept can be useful in helping us to think about the modes of engendering lived time spaces. In particular, Bakhtin argued for the need to see, and I quote, spatial and temporal indicators as fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Thus, as he explains, and I quote, time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and histories. In the absence of ontological grounds, then, and faced with the paradoxical situation of an erasing presence, racial effects are therefore detected by a pressing into flesh of time and a charging of space in response to the movements of time, plot, and histories. Having regard to racial effects as a haunting, this requires, as Avery Gordon states, a very peculiar way of knowing what has happened or is happening. I would like to push a bit further and add an interpretive schema to our particular ghostly figure of race by relating it to what Hansen and Steputat refer to in their text, sovereign bodies, as the sovereign will to rule. As such, I would like to prefer that we should treat race first and foremost as an apparatic rule structure implicated in that summoning of a particular relation of forces to the fore of our consciousness. This relation of forces, I argue, is that of the sovereign and the abject, which is in itself historically constituted and seeks to compose itself to a certain philosophy of place. Place here understood in the Heideggerian term as the capacity to be present. Okay, what I would like to do next is just highlight a few of the issues in relationship to sovereignty and racial rule, and then try and just briefly overview the comment on the relationship between race and primitive accumulation. How much time do I have?
Who's the guardian of time? 10 minutes, maybe.
Okay. So my main claim has been that we need to treat race as an aperitic rule structure, which is related to the invocation of a particular relation of forces which generates a connection between the sovereign and the abject. So what I'd like to do is just highlight the nature of sovereignty, because my main argument is that it's through this sovereign abject relationship that race becomes formed. So, in their text, Hansen and Stepetat, following Foucault's lead, wish first to displace the treatment of sovereignty as a formal de jure property whose efficacy, to a large extent, is derived from being externally recognized by other states as both sovereign and legitimate. Second, they want to question the obviousness of the state-territory sovereignty link. They offer rather to conceptualize the territorial state and sovereignty as social constructions. In addition, they wish to, and I quote, shift the ground for our understanding of sovereignty from issues of territory and external recognition of states to issues of internal constitution of sovereign power within states through the exercise of violence over bodies and populations. However, I want to quickly point out that sovereignty is not merely a negative power, but rather it is a force introduced, as Hegel argued, in the philosophy of right, in order to achieve, and I quote, the ends of the whole. Wendy Brown, in her discussion of sovereignty, reinforces this idea through her elaborations on the idea of Schmitt and Hobbes, and especially in regards to what she calls the theology of sovereignty. Thus, she notes that in both Schmitt and Hobbes, sovereignty exercises itself not only in relation to the proper fiction of absolute autonomy in determining and deciding boundaries and borders, but in relationship to its ideal standing as the condition for life, the protector and guarantor for the same. Hobbes, she notes, sets up the ontotheological stakes for modern social life through Leviathan, which represents man's monster, the height of man's own creative power, and hence, I would argue or suggest, a chronotope symbol for capitalism's geopolitical spaces of accumulation and its chronotime of freedom or liberalism. She goes on to further highlight that sovereignty for Hobbes, as he states himself in his introduction to Leviathan, and I quote, is the soul of the man-made creature. It is what gives life and motion to his whole body, to this whole body. Sovereignty in Leviathan operates as a symbolic mediator for God, who is a force that delimits itself against the unassimilable. That is, whatever is stated as a profane risk or threat to the conditions for life itself. In similar fashion, I argue, modern sovereignty seeks to say and establish the unassimilable risk to its managed creation of life. And relatedly, its perceived mode and boundaries for creating Leviathan's life and motion in relationship to the whole body. Sovereignty's God trick lies then not simply in the gaze, God's viewpoint, or Lefebvre's illusion of transparency, where all that is hidden becomes available and knowledge and space become a field for action or modern power. More importantly, it lies in its need to effect, or rather, to show itself effective in the defense of the time-space of Leviathan, the artifice presented as a summa cum laude of modern man's being and becoming in the world. This second move, sovereignty's neediness, I have sought to expose in other work as the inauguration of a peculiar sovereign imaginary rooted in the liberal ideals of freedom, which manifest in a fetish of transparency. That is, a notion of transcendental autonomy or self-cause. This, I argued, is as a result of this sovereignty of the imagination, as a result of this sovereignty's imagination of autonomy, it is paradoxically necessary to invoke what I refer to as the abject or spectral blackness. That is, a thing in a state of being without. In those essays, I argued that this form of blackness lies in its quality of undecidability and less in its enforced liminal performances of cultural tropes of certain racialized identities. And second, I argue that this undecidability arises in virtue of one being caught up in the structure of disavowal given rise to the idea of sovereignty and its field of force relations. In setting up sovereignty, then, one introduces a contrast class to a thing sutured into it as sovereignlessness. In this case, blackness derives principally from the sovereign abject relation that gives warrant to this relation of forces sustaining modern Leviathan. I believe this complicates deeply the reading of modern histories of accumulation and the rise of modern nation states. But it is a step that requires further elaboration in order to understand further the processes of globalization and its modes of accumulation in relationship to race. In the last section, which I had mentioned, where I would pull the links together between race and processes of primitive accumulation as well as sovereignty, I tried to indicate that the principal way of thinking through primary accumulation as being solely derived in a historical phase where there is an originary violence to create the capital relation is not necessarily grounded in the observance of the nature of accumulation, that it has a longer duration or it continues through time, as argued by Perelman in The Invention of Capitalism. So what I wanted to do at this point is just briefly indicate what I think some of the main points are in this presentation. I've tried to outline and argue that race operates principally, or the spectrum of race operates principally as an apparatic rule structure working through the sovereign imaginary, which expresses itself as this sovereign abject relationship. This leads us to think through racialized power operating in society through this sovereign-object relationship and its invidious chronopolitics of time-space. I believe that this vantage point of thinking global Blackness through the framework of Cleese Angelus Nouveau, allowing us both for engaging with the debris of progress as well as the imaginary of redemption, provides a vital space in which to think through the character of global Blackness in reading our possibilities for future progress. Thank you for your attention, and I want to apologize for the kind of cut and paste discussion at the end. As I indicated, the paper was still in progress and I hadn't quite gotten all the elements together in time. So I was kind of trying to think out loud with my rough notes. But as I fully develop this discussion, the arguments will be given a greater solidity. But I hope in the line of the presentation that you were able to follow the main points that I had presented, and of course, open up for your questions or comments or contributions on my presentation. But thank you for your attention to my presentation.